A couple weeks ago, I was curious about who the starting quarterbacks in the NFL were a decade ago, and the video completely popped off and you guys really enjoyed it, so I decided I'm going to do the same thing except for running backs. We're going to do exactly what I just said. We're going to talk about who each and every starting running back for every NFL team was back in 2014, and quickly go through who it was and how they did. But before we get started, if you're a big fan of football, be sure to subscribe to the channel. Leave a like if you want to support today's video, and let me know what player, team, topic, or situation I can cover in my next one. Now let's get started and talk about all 32 starting running backs from 10 years ago in the NFL. Okay, so the first team we're to talk about is the Arizona Cardinals, and their starting running back was Andre Ellington. He was a 6th round pick out of Clemson the year prior, and the Cardinals were a pass-first offense and ended the year at 11-5, but Andre would injure his hip in week 14 and was put on season-ending IR, finishing with 660 rushing yards and 3 total touchdowns. I haven't thought about this guy in a while. For the Atlanta Falcons, Steven Jackson was the starting running back, as he was a 3-time Pro Bowler and was a first-round pick with the Rams before coming over to Atlanta in 2013. 2014 was his last season as a Falcon, and it wasn't good. He put up just about 700 yards and 6 touchdowns, and the Falcons went 6-10. He'd spend one more year in New England before officially retiring in 2015. For the Baltimore Ravens, Justin Forsett was there in 2014 to be the backup behind Bernard Pierce and Ray Rice, but after Rice got suspended and Pierce got hurt, he ended up having his best season yet. Forsett ran for 1,266 yards and 8 touchdowns, helping Baltimore go 10-6 and make the playoffs. He played in his only Pro Bowl as an alternate that year. For the Buffalo Bills, Fred Jackson was the starting running back. He'd been at Buffalo since 2006 after being picked up on a whim because the coach was literally an alumni of his D3 school. He ended up finishing the 2014 season with 525 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns. He'd be cut from Buffalo in the offseason and spent one more year in the NFL before he would eventually retire. D'Angelo Williams was the starting running back for the Carolina Panthers, as they ended up going 7-8-1 and won the NFC South. Their starting running back was obviously D'Angelo, as he had been the best running back in Panthers history since he was drafted in 2006, but he faced injury after injury in 2014 and only ended up playing in 6 games. He finished with just 219 rushing yards and was out of the NFL 3 years later. Chicago had a name that everybody knew, and that was Matt Forte. He had been starting since his rookie season back in 2008, and he finished with just over 1,000 yards, adding 6 rushing touchdowns as well as a career-high 800 receiving yards and 4 scores through the air. The Bears sadly though went 5-11, and he'd spend one more year in Chicago before spending 2 seasons with the Jets and retiring in 2018. For the Cincinnati Bengals, Giovanni Bernard was their starting running back, but he was the backup his rookie year the season prior. He ended up splitting time with Jeremy Hill, but ran for 680 yards and 5 touchdowns. He did miss 3 weeks with a leg injury and would eventually get beaten out by Hill as the starter. He spent most of his career in Cincinnati and then retired in 2023. Going up north to Cleveland, Terrence West was the starting running back. He was actually a rookie coming out of Towson, which was an FCS school. In his first game, he went for over 100 yards, but he never got back to that level and finished with just over 600 yards and 4 touchdowns. The Cleveland Browns went 7-9, and he'd get cut before the start of the 2015 season, and then would split time with the Titans and the Ravens before retiring in 2018. The Cowboys had another big name, and that was DeMarco Murray. He was in his last year in Dallas, and that year he made a name for himself as a free agent after running for a league-leading 1,800 yards and 13 touchdowns. He'd helped the Cowboys go 12-4, and he was the Offensive Player of the Year. He'd be out of the league just 4 years later after being a free agent bust with the Eagles, and then got beaten out by Derrick Henry with the Titans. The Denver Broncos had a big name coming out of college, and that was Monty Ball. The 12-4 Broncos drafted the Wisconsin standout, and he was supposed to be the guy, but kept getting leg injuries and only started in 3 games, and was eventually passed up by CJ Anderson because of it. He ended up finishing the year with 172 yards and 1 touchdown, and would end up with the Patriots in 2015 and out of the league by 2016. For Detroit, Joique Bell was the starter at the time, and he played alongside Reggie Bush as a running back tandem. It ended up working out, as the Lions went 11-5 behind Bell's 860 yards and 7 touchdowns, while Bush was used more as a decoy and a receiving threat. That was Joique's best season in Detroit, as he'd be out of the league by 2017. The Green Bay Packers had a legendary name, and that was Eddie Lacy. He took over for James Starks. Eddie's unorthodox size and athleticism led him to being hard to stop, and he ended up running for 1,200 yards and 9 touchdowns. The Packers would go 12-4, but he would struggle to keep his weight low enough to play, and he'd be out of the league by 2018. For the Houston Texans, Arian Foster was the starting running back. In 2014, the Texans went 9-7, and he improved from a 500-yard season in 2013 to a near top of the league 1,300 yards in 2014. This was his fourth year over 1,000 yards, and he also had 8 rushing touchdowns. He also did this despite missing 3 games with an injury. He would tear his Achilles the following season before signing with the Dolphins and retiring after the 2016 season. For the Indianapolis Colts, they were hoping to get some potential out of Trent Richardson. The Colts went 11-5 in 2014, but it was mostly without the help of their starting running back Trent Richardson, who had been traded to the Colts from the Browns the year prior. He finished with just 500 yards and 3 touchdowns, and he'd flame out of the NFL after just that season, and then played in the CFL, the AAF, and even in Mexico, and is currently a football coach. For Jacksonville, Toby Gerhart was the starting running back at the time. They went 3-13 in 2014 behind Gerhart as their starting back, and the former Heisman snub ended up in Jacksonville after spending 4 years at Minnesota, but he only ran for 300 yards and 2 touchdowns and was out of the league after the next season. He kept getting injured and really wasn't much of a help as the starting running back and didn't do much. For Kansas City, they also had a big name in Jamal Charles. He was the starting back in 2014 and became the all-time rushing yards leader for the Chiefs with over 1,000 yards and 9 touchdowns to go with 5 touchdowns as a pass catcher. This would end up being his last 1,000-yard season as he kept getting injured and then spent time on multiple teams before retiring back in 2019. The St. Louis Rams at the time had Zach Stacy, as he was now in his second year in 2014. Sadly, he'd finished with 293 yards and 1 touchdown, and then the Rams would take Todd Gurley in the draft the next season, and then he asked to be traded to New York, where he flamed out of the NFL entirely. He did briefly retire to take care of his brother before attempting failed comebacks in the CFL and AAF, and if I remember right, Zach Stacy was also in some legal trouble. The Miami Dolphins had brought in former Broncos running back Noshawn Moreno to be their guy in 2014, but he'd only play in a total of 3 games due to different injuries. He'd suffer a season-ending ACL tear in the one that ended his career, and in total he finished with 148 yards and 1 touchdown on just 31 total carries. For Minnesota, they had one of the best running backs in the NFL in Adrian Peterson. They went 7-9 in 2014, and this was largely because of the absence of AP. He started the first game with the Vikings, but then was deactivated because of that incident with his son, and he sat out the rest of the year with just 75 yards. The guys who stepped up in his place were Jerick McKinnon and Matt Asiata, who combined for over 1,000 yards. Over in New England, things were going well for the Patriots, and they ended up having Shane Vereen as their starting running back. He'd end up only starting 6 games for the Pats that year and finished with 391 yards and 2 touchdowns, and the other running backs in the room were LeGarrette Blount, Stephen Ridley, and Jonas Gray. Going down south to New Orleans, Mark Ingram was the starting running back, and the Saints went 7-9. He missed a few games with injury, but still managed to put up over 900 yards and 9 rushing touchdowns. He would stay in New Orleans until his suspension in 2018, where he would then bounce around between Baltimore and Houston before retiring as a Saint in 2023. For the New York Giants, they had Rashad Jennings as their guy. He ended up coming over from the Oakland Raiders in free agency and became the starting back. He played in just 11 games, finishing with 639 yards and 4 touchdowns. After a great season in 2015, he was released in 2017 and retired later that same year. He spent a couple of years in fan-controlled football, and Jennings kind of just flamed out. For the New York Jets, Chris Ivory was their running back. That's a name I have not thought about in years. The season was a disaster, going 4-12, and he ended up having a decent year. He finished with 821 yards and 6 touchdowns, but it wasn't enough to keep the Jets competitive. He put up over 1,000 yards in New York the next year before signing with Jacksonville in 2015, and then fizzling out with the Bills in 2017, and then retiring. The Oakland Raiders grabbed a former big-time college football star in Darren McFadden, and this was the first full season they finally got out of him. Sadly, the Raiders only went 3-13, and he ended up running for 534 yards and 2 touchdowns. They decided not to bring him back for 2015, and then he ended up in Dallas, where he played for 3 years before retiring in 2018. At the time, the Philadelphia Eagles had LaShawn McCoy, and this was his last season with them. He ended up running for 1,300 yards and 5 touchdowns, and the Eagles went 10-6. For some reason, though, Chip Kelly traded him to Buffalo before the start of the next year, where he'd then go on to have 2 more 1,000-yard seasons. He then won back-to-back Super Bowls as a backup in KC and Tampa Bay before he would retire. Pittsburgh had a superstar at running back as the Steelers won 11-5 behind the back of Le'Veon Bell. Bell ran for a career-high 1,400 yards and 8 touchdowns, and also had over 800 receiving yards and 3 touchdowns as well. He became the starter in Pittsburgh until his holdout in 2018 when he was traded to New York before fizzling out of the league in 2021. For the San Diego Chargers, they went 9-7 with Ryan Matthews as their starting running back. He would sprain his ankle twice during the season, and he'd end up only playing in 6 total games for the Chargers. He finished with 330 total yards and 3 rushing touchdowns. He then signed with the Philadelphia Eagles the next year as a backup and would retire in 2017 after a neck injury. The San Francisco 49ers ended up having a future Hall of Famer on their roster, as Frank Gore was the guy in 2014. He'd helped the Niners go 8-8 and ran for 1,100 yards and 4 touchdowns in 16 games. This was just a year after his last Pro Bowl appearance, and after the season, he'd go to Indianapolis for 3 years before spending time in Miami, Buffalo, and New York, before finally retiring in 2021. Going across the country to Seattle, the Seahawks had made it to the Super Bowl on the back of Marshawn Lynch as their back. He was invited to the Pro Bowl after rushing for 1,300 yards and a league-leading 13 touchdowns. This made it all more confusing why the Seahawks didn't give him the football to win that game, and we all know what happened, but from there he'd bounce around between the Raiders and the Seahawks over his last 4 years before retiring in 2020. Okay, so before we get to our last 3 players, take a quick moment to like the video and give me a suggestion on which year or position group I should do next. For Tampa Bay, Doug Martin was the starting back in 2014, as there wasn't much good going on in Tampa at the time, as the Bucs went 2-14. Doug ended up running for 500 yards and 2 rushing touchdowns though, and he's coming off of a shoulder injury and played in 11 games. He'd spend 3 more seasons in Tampa Bay before spending 1 more year in Oakland in 2018. For the Tennessee Titans, they also went 2-14 in 2014, and their starting back was Sean Green. He ended up starting just 5 games in 2014, putting up 392 yards and 2 rushing scores. He was released after the season since he had gotten beaten out by Bishop Sankey and then retired from football altogether. Okay, so our last guy is for the Washington Redskins, and that was Alfred Morris. They ended up leaning on 2 running backs that season, as it was Roy Halou Jr. and Alfred, but Morris was considered the starter for the 4-12 Skins. He finished the year with over 1,000 rushing yards and 8 rushing touchdowns, and made his 2nd straight Pro Bowl. He'd then become a journeyman running back after that, spending time with Dallas, San Francisco, Arizona, and the Giants before retiring in 2021. So yeah, today we went through all 32 NFL teams from 2014 and talked about who their starting running back was and what happened to him. What do you guys think though? Was this just a nostalgia trip for you? Who are some guys that you completely forgot about? And what year or position group should I do next? Be sure to let me know down below, leave a like if you support today's video, subscribe if you're new, and check out my other videos on the end screen, including my video about the 2014 NFL starting quarterbacks. I hope to see you guys again soon, but until next time, peace.